Hi folks, this is David Birchall, Subject Coordinator for Australian Politics in autumn 2022. Because this weekend's election had an interesting result, and because it's timely and topical and part of the material of our unit, I thought I'd put together a quick PowerPoint with audio, which I'll also upload to YouTube as an MP4 to get us thinking in classes this week. You'll see on the right hand side of the PowerPoint there, of course, Australia's new Prime Minister designate, Anthony Albanese. And bottom right hand corner there, you'll see some election advertising you probably passed by yourself or something very like it on election day on Saturday. And you'll see there that I'm planning to take us through a quick overview of the election results and then talk about some themes of the election that I think are relevant to themes of this unit. Okay, I'm recording this on Sunday night. The election was held on Saturday evening, so things may change a bit, but most of the votes for the House of Representatives have been counted, and I think the overall result is clear. There has been nationwide around about a 3.5% swing to the Australian Labor Party on a two-party preferred basis, as we say in Australia, which has been enough to bring around about a change of government. We don't know the exact final numbers in the House of Representatives yet, but Labor is likely to have a majority or else be able to form a minority government with the help of one or two senators, most likely from the Greens. And the coalition, the Liberal National Party coalition, has lost quite a lot of seats. Despite the fact that this is a triumph for the Labor Party, however, after the best part of a decade in opposition, it's a curious election result, and I think brings up some of the themes, or a range of themes from this subject this semester. The first is, I think, that while the major parties or party coalitions, the Liberal National Party on the one hand and Labor on the other, still remain the essential largest parts of the political picture in Australian politics, their share of the vote has fallen significantly again after a long but slow decline in the first preference votes for the major parties over the last several decades since the early mid-1990s. This time round, if you put together the coalition and Labor, you only get to around about 68%, as things stand right now, of first preference votes, meaning that more than 30% voted for somebody else, including the Greens, Independents, Teal or otherwise, and smaller right-wing parties such as One Nation and the United Australian Party. The ALP in the end, once you count preferences in our preferential system in Australia, received about 52% of the vote, which is probably going to be enough to get them a majority government. But they only received 32%-ish of the first preference votes, and the remainder was made up by preferences from people whose first preference went elsewhere. The Liberal National Party coalition received a bit more of the first preference votes, about 36%, but only 48% all told of preferences. So you can see more people preferenced the Labor Party even though they didn't vote for them. So the party with the fewer number of first preference votes ended up with significantly more of the all preference votes. So this is a distinctive election result that would not have happened in actually any other country in the world. Also worth mentioning that there were very different swings in different states, and I've also linked to the View site for this week an article from the ABC website which shows the difference between the swings. I don't have it to hand. In Western Australia, where it was well over 10%, Tasmania, where there was no swing to Labor, actually the other way, and other states where there was a relatively modest swing. There is no evidence of any kind of uniform swing across the country or even across regions in this election. Though it's not kind of random, there are various themes to the election that make a lot of sense. As I mentioned already, Australia's preferential voting system for the House of Representatives in Canberra, which is a compulsory preferential system, as you will be aware from the weekend, you had to vote for all the candidates in your electorate, is unique in the world. And we talked about it over the course of the semester. This election outcome in Australia was the result of the preferential system and would not have happened with other systems. Though we can't predict what would have happened with other systems exactly, of course, because people change the way they vote according to the electoral system. The preferential system was essential to the outcome of this election in Australia because an historically large number of people chose to preference someone else rather than the major parties and then go on to preference the major parties in ways that made quite significant difference to the election result. In fact, more of a difference to the result than I think any Australian election previously. Labor won a number of seats, actually quite a lot of seats, with the preferences from the Greens, which flowed to them quite strongly, as they generally do. The Greens are normally thought of as being to the left of Labor. The so-called teal independents, teal being a colour somewhere between blue, the Liberal Party's colour, and green, the symbolic colour of the environment, won all of their seats where they conquered traditional Liberal electorates with preferences from the Labor Party and sometimes also the Greens. And Labor also lost preferences themselves to, if you like, populist parties on the right, such as One Nation and United Australian Party, which sometimes then flowed on to the coalition. If everyone had voted exactly the same way, allowing for the non-existence of preferences, either the first past the post system used in the United States and the UK or the proportional representation system used in large parts of Europe would have clearly have produced different results. If people hadn't had preferences and had simply cast first preference votes, the coalition probably have won the election, however with a historically low percentage of the vote at 36%. Under a proportional representation system, if you look at the vote for independents and the Greens and right-wing small parties, it would have been impossible either for Labor or Coalition to govern in their own right, and they would have had to get together a coalition of other parties, which would have been probably quite difficult in the case of the Coalition, given the nature of the small right-wing parties. A headline outcome of the election, particularly for people who view the ABC, which was very much taken by it, was the loss by the Liberal National Party coalition of some of their safest seats, some of which had not been lost by the coalition in decades, one or two of them perhaps never before, seats which they had traditionally held by 20% plus margins. In Melbourne and especially in Sydney, on Sydney's North Shore and in the eastern suburbs, the sort of blue ribbon Liberal electorates of folklore. And these were lost to the so-called teal independents. You can see that's the colour teal there, sort of bluey, greeny, centrist independents who have generally sort of conservative views on economic issues, but are concerned about climate change and also governmental corruption. Meanwhile, in another striking development, Labor's smallest swings came in its own heartland. There were a lot of, as it were, traditional Labor seats which recorded little or no swing to Labor, and a few seats that Labor would once have called its own seats where the swing actually went the other way. So there was a paradox in the election. More affluent voters who traditionally voted for the coalition drifted away from the coalition, not to Labor, but to centrist independents, while Labor's rusted-on supporters drifted away from it, even as it gathered together more seats. This is not an entirely surprising development because it's what's happened in the United States and in other parts of the Western world over the last few years, where there's been a major realignment of the electorate, particularly in the United States, where you are more likely now to vote for the Conservative Party, the Republican Party, if you don't have a college degree, than if you do, and you're more likely to vote for the Democratic Party. That didn't happen here. Nevertheless, there was clearly a shift of a kind that's historically unusual in Australia. However, whereas in the United States, this realignment of the electorate has mostly worked for the Republican Party under Donald Trump, the Conservatives in the United States, who've gathered together disaffected blue-collar voters, white blue-collar voters, I should say. In Australia, the effect seems to have been the opposite. The Labor Party seems to be the net winner because there has been a much greater movement of affluent voters away from the coalition than there has been a movement of poorer voters away from the Labor Party. After the election, coalition veterans in various commentary boxes around the country observed that their party seemed to have lost votes because of its apparent hostility to addressing climate change. and that those votes were lost in the more affluent seats in its heartlands, where also gender equality and the experience of women in Parliament and the proposal for a commission to regulate electoral behaviour and to avoid electoral corruption were also important issues. So these were the big issues in the more affluent seats. In the inner cities, which are also nowadays rather affluent, climate change seems to have been far and away the most important issue. But in outer suburbs and in regions, climate change was a less important issue. And in coal regions like the Hunter, it seems not to have been important at all. And all of this fits, I think, with the experience of other Western countries in recent years and decades, where so-called values issues, though they're not just about values, if you like, issues that aren't directly economic, seem to become more important, but are also more important with voters who have a high level of education, and economic bread and butter issues, if you like, have remained more important with people with lower educational levels. This has often proved to be a dilemma for centre-left type parties like the Labor Party, who tends to get stuck between a rock and a hard place. So there's some themes from our subject that are really obvious from the weekend election, I think. The election marks a low watermark of support for the major parties and the highest number of votes for other parties and independents in Australia's history since Federation. It's also marked, to remember earlier weeks, by debates about political corruption and people's disillusionment with the political process or the major parties. Not that that's actually new, it's a recurring theme, but it was particularly strong. A distinctive voting system, the preferential system in the lower house, clearly played a major role in the outcome. It allowed people in more affluent seats who traditionally voted Liberal not to vote Liberal without having to take the terrifying step of voting Labor, and that clearly disadvantaged the Liberal Party. The Labor Party seems to have suffered significantly less from that. Its voters were less inclined to park their votes elsewhere. The experience of women in the political process and in Parliament was clearly a significant theme of the election, and Julia Gillard appeared on the hustings for Labor for the first time in a while. And the so-called teal independents were, I think, all female candidates, and they were mostly deliberately targeted against male incumbents. So there was clearly a gender theme to the election as well. Climate change and addressing it was clearly a key issue, even though neither of the major parties had put it at the forefront of their agenda, and Labor hadn't mentioned it much at all. Nevertheless, Labor was clearly understood to be pro-climate change, as of course with the Greens and the so-called teal independents. And addressing climate change or climate change mitigations appears to have been the winner on election night overall. The pandemic was thought to, it was assumed the pandemic would play a role in the election. I don't think it played an enormous role, but it did play a role in Western Australia, clearly, where the federal government's lack of sympathy towards Western Australia's hard lockdown seems to have cost it a great many votes in Western Australia, and previously safe Liberal seats in Perth and elsewhere in Western Australia fell spectacularly. Lastly, but not least, the new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, highlighted the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which we discussed last week, as the key theme of Labor's Indigenous policy in government, and foreshadowed a referendum on that issue. I think that came as a surprise to a lot of people because Labor hadn't talked about it much during the election, but if people had followed the debate within the Labor Party and elsewhere, it was probably not so much of a surprise. So we might all want to have another look at the Uluru Statement to remind ourselves what it says. Okay, that's enough for the moment. See folks in classes this week and have a fun discussion.